Morning all, and welcome to this week's recruitment discussion. And this week we're going to look at legislation and sort of a legal update, but more around sort of employee contracts and rather than around the client side of things. So we're looking at sort of how your non-compete clause obsolete, and how do you cope with departing consultants? We think is very important. Now, the question I've been asked by sort of most clients about this webinar is, does our contract really matter as long as we've got the most important clauses in? So let me sort of give you an idea why. This is the recruitment sector in the UK. The recruitment sector in the UK employs around about 110,000 people in more than 40,000 businesses, according to the 2021 stats. The recruitment market in the UK is worth £38 billion, of which 80% of that revenue is generated via temporary and contract placements. Only 16% of the recruitment agencies that were in existence before 2008. So if you can look at that over the last 14 years, a massive increase of recruitment agencies. And this is a really interesting stat. 1 in every 67 limited companies registered in the UK is a recruitment agency. 6,000 plus recruitment agencies were registered in 2021, which was up 3% on the year before. So despite sort of growing year on year, the UK industry struggles though with a whopping 43% turnover rate. Now that came from Perkbox. The UK average is 15%. So let's sort of think about why our contract needs to be important. If we got 43% attrition, that means 47,300 recruiters are moving each year. 12% of those recruiters are opening a new agency. Now, to me, that's potentially a huge amount of data that's leaving a business and going to another business, because irrespective of what we think, when recruiters leave, they take lots of information with them and they use that information to open new businesses or simply go to a competitor and work with a competitor. Now, what I couldn't find out was how many recruiters had actually been taken to court for breach of their employment contract. Yes, there are a few cases mentioned, okay, but if you think out of those 47,300 recruiters who moved last year, I wonder how many didn't abide by their terms and conditions and took data, and yet what did we do about that? How do we do something about that? This week, Mr. Jacobs and Mr. Pye on assignment in Bristol. So we're being joined by, obviously, what we would class as one of the leading HR directors in the UK, Heather Slawway, who's going to help us navigate through this minefield. So no pressure on you, Heather, and what's going on from that. So I'm sure you're going to enjoy this, because what your normal comment is, I don't want the first question. Today you have no choice on the first question, because you're the only person answering the questions. But I will jump in where I see fit from there. So as a business owner, we rely really on that non-compete clause, or that restrictive clause known as the PTR, sort of post-termination restraint, as a clause in our contract. So the question is, how watertight are those clauses?
Okay, interesting opener on this one. And I think, although there's only the two of us, Howard, I think it would be quite interesting for us to debate our different perspectives on this, because my perspective is, from HR and legal and that side of this discussion, whereas yours is, you've operated in this market. So I think it will be interesting for us to gently debate our different points of view on this. So in terms of how watertight, absolutely, it depends on what you've got written down in your contract. There are good non-compete clauses, and there are bad non-compete clauses, and there are good post-termination restriction clauses, and there are poor ones, good and bad in these things. And the wording really does matter. So courts can just throw out clauses that are not well written. So having good contracts here is really important. Bear in mind about how watertight it is. It's far harder to enforce widely drafted clauses, particularly widely drafted non-compete clauses. Generally, the UK courts don't really like non-compete clauses, and they're really quite hard to enforce unless they're very, very narrowly drafted. And they're much more likely to enforce post-termination restrictions. So post-termination restrictions are much more carefully written. Yeah, so a non-compete clause says you can't go and work for a competitor. Courts don't like enforcing those. Post-termination restrictions say you can't contact candidates, you can't contact clients, you can't poach my staff. So they're much more specific and they're much more enforceable.
What we're saying is then we should really be sort of splitting those two out. That non-compete and that non-restrictive clause should be actually two separate clauses, where I've read in lots of contracts where they're almost sort of bundled into one, and we think that non-compete clause, which is the one that really when you go to court, it's, and I've read the court cases that this year, or some of the court cases this year, when they go to court, they're the ones that they really sort of push on. And what we talk about that non-compete, what they're talking about is, if you look at, say, Tillman versus Egon, I think it was, that went to Supreme Court, they were sort of talking about that 6-month non-compete, and they said that went too far for restraining a former employee from holding a minority shareholding in a competing business. So it's not just about moving to business; it's about shareholding in other businesses, etc., etc., etc.
Generally, the UK courts don't like stopping somebody going and earning a living, right? So it's quite difficult to stop somebody going and working in a competing business altogether. You can absolutely restrict what they can do in terms of your data, your candidates, your clients, those post-termination restrictions. But the non-compete's pretty tough, and it's worth thinking, and we'll talk a bit more about this, about whether you even try.
So I think there's a comment there. I thought it's interesting about that even try, because I was sort of going through the stuff this morning and started to look at it. When I started to look at the non-compete, what I started to think about was that non-compete side should really be up for senior managers, directors, etc., etc.
Absolutely.
Don't even worry about it in your consultants. But that restrictive or PRT, those type of clauses then should be far more detailed in your consultant's contract and how that's written within those contracts.
Absolutely. So you definitely shouldn't be having just standard non-compete and post-termination restriction clauses that are the same for everyone. So they should be specific to the role, the seniority, and the level of risk to your business. So the more junior, the less restrictive your contract would be. The more senior, the more restrictive you can be, and the more likely you are to be able to enforce it.
Okay, so that's interesting that as people move through the business, we should be thinking about upgrading their contract and delivering a different type of contract to them, which then gives them a more in-depth non-compete and a more in-depth post-termination restraints, depending on their seniority.
The problem that I see, Howard, that I've seen is that somebody might have joined the organisation in an admin role or as a resourcer, and actually probably didn't have anything about not competing or any kind of post-termination restrictions in the contract at all. And over time, they're promoted and can become very senior in the organisation, but they've only ever had letters confirming promotions rather than issuing an appropriate contract with appropriate restrictions in it as they've progressed through the organisation.
So when we start to think about it in that way, when we start to promote people, then if we start to look at promoting them and giving them a new position, and we give them a new contract, so their bonuses, their promotion, their pay rises should be conditional on the employee then entering into a fresh restriction that may come with the more seniority of the role.
Yes. Yeah, that's definitely one way of approaching it, because you can't just ask somebody to accept restrictions without some kind of benefit to them around it. So you can't just one day say, oh, by the way, these restrictions now apply to you. So the best way to do it is when you're promoting somebody or when you're giving them a pay review to have new contracts that are associated with that. And it won't be applicable with every promotion that people have. If you've got an organization with a lot of different positions in your progression scale, that there may be only certain ones of them that require changes, but I think you do need to think it through.
Yeah, and I think that's important as people start to build more career based businesses where there is a career ladder in that business and there's a defined ladder to go through, and they see the transition from being, say, as you say, a junior into recruiter into a senior recruiter. But when you start to step across that line into management, team leader, management, directorship, etc., that's when we start to think about changing the clauses within the contract, because that becomes a bigger issue if that person leaves. Correct. So here's a slightly different question on that sort of from, we spend hundreds and thousands of pounds on technology to hold our data. So in your experience, how safe is that data if a consultant wants to leave and wants to extract it?
There's two really, really different type answers to this question. There's two totally different ways of looking at. So the first one is, if somebody really wants to extract your data, it's almost impossible to stop. If they really, really want to steal your data, they can, because you cannot lock it down enough to prevent them from sitting in front of a screen and writing stuff down. Or you can't. So from one point of view, it's really hard to stop it. However, you have to make every reasonable effort to protect that data. From a GDPR point of view, you can't just have that data available to all and sundry and be downloadable. And so you can make it hard for people. So there shouldn't be legitimate ways of making mass downloads of personal data, particularly your candidate data, which there's all kinds of GDPR implications for doing that. So you must put in some lockdowns. From a GDPR point of view, you've got to be able to demonstrate that you're protecting that data, and you need to create that culture in your organization that people understand and value the sanctity of data. So a lot of this is about the culture that you're creating. So you should make it hard, but the reality is, unless you really lock stuff, I mean, some of the businesses I've worked with in India, Howard, for example, they're very, very clued up on GDPR, and so their staff will leave their phones in lockers before they go in to see the recruiters' data at all, the recruitment businesses in the UK's data. So phones are locked away. They sat at the desk, they have a clear desk policy. So everything they do is on the screen. Now that makes it incredibly difficult to steal
I can just imagine the people that are on the webinar now almost physically shaking the fact that someone would take their phone off them at the door and say, "Here, you've got to lock it in a box for the whole day." They'd be like,
culturally, we just don't do that stuff, do we? And also, the reality is, working from home has made our data less secure.
So let's put GDPR to one side. Because what you're saying there was what a question in this is, we're spending £1,000 on technology and holding data. So what we're saying is then that the way that we hold our data is really important. Now, we know that if somebody wants to, I remember a person at a company I worked with who got caught as the manager went in at the weekend and found this person sat in front of their screen taking photographs of every single page because they couldn't download it. It was just ridiculous type of scenario, but it was those scenarios. But if you start to think about what we talk about, and we talk about data and how we work on data, but data is held in numerous different silos across recruitment agencies, depending on how that agency is. So if we start to limit the number of silos that we hold that data, and this is the bit that we've got to understand what a silo is. So your email is a silo. Your CRM is a silo. If they're putting anything on Excel spreadsheets, it's a silo. If they're putting it into OneDrive, it's a different silo. If it's in SharePoint, it's a different silo. If it's on LinkedIn, it's a different silo. So you've got hundreds and hundreds of different silos that we could hold data in, where people could be extracting data from without you knowing. So how would you control that? Because obviously that's a huge amount of data sort of just swimming around your business that is almost uncontrolled, where we think we've got our data in our CRM and it's controlled in our CRM to a certain degree, but it's in loads and loads and loads of other places. And how many companies do I go to when they go, they've got a really good CRM going, and you go to a candidate or go to a consultant and say, can you give me an idea what you're doing this month, etc. And they pull up an Excel spreadsheet of everything they've got, which has got the candidate's name, the candidate's number, the client's name, the client's number on, which is just another silo of data held somewhere else.
Before we even think about what's in WhatsApp. right, on people's personal WhatsApp.
I didn't even want to get into WhatsApp, but there you go.
So that's so there is one whole webinar that we could do on the GDPR piece of that, but let's put that to one side. Yeah, so there's a whole GDPR issue around data and data silos and protecting that data, but as you say, let's put that to one side because it's not the focus of what we're talking about today. If you write your post-termination restrictions well, and they talk about candidates, clients, prospects, temporary workers, they define them well, and they put in reasonable restrictions about what you can and can't do with them after you leave an organization. It actually doesn't matter which silos that data is held in. So there is a big question mark about restricting information on LinkedIn. I mean, that's one really big thing. We build LinkedIn networks personally. They're not, those LinkedIn networks aren't technically owned by our employer unless our employer has given us the LinkedIn account. So the reality is where the silo of information is doesn't matter from a post-termination restrictions point of view, as long as your post-termination restrictions are written well. So as long as it's defined, what is a candidate that you're restricted from dealing with, what is a temporary worker that you're restricted from dealing with, who is a client, and have we thought about what makes a restricted client or candidate, then it doesn't matter which silo they sit in from the point of view of restricting your ability to deal with them if you leave.
So GDPR covers that. Let's just go into that little comment there on LinkedIn. And this is my understanding of LinkedIn, because I've seen some, horrendous practices from employers on LinkedIn platforms. So the question is, and I think I know the answer to the question, but I'm interested to see what your thoughts are, is who actually owns the data on, I'm going to talk about Howard Greenwood's LinkedIn license. So I've got 12, 13,000 connections and similar number of followers, etc., on LinkedIn. Who owns that data? Is it me? Is it Jump? Is it LinkedIn? Who actually owns the data? So if I left Jump and Jump said I want you to delete all that data, who has the right of comment on that?
It is a very complicated question.
Good.
It's a very, very complicated question. So I'll answer it to the best of my knowledge, but bear in mind that LinkedIn changed their terms of doing business quite regularly. So it's possible that this does change. So generally, the LinkedIn terms of doing business say that the person who sets the account up, they're responsible for their own data and they own their own data. So it's very difficult for an employer to claim to own the network that an individual recruiter creates on LinkedIn unless the employer provides them with a LinkedIn account which is associated for and paid for by the employer, that is separate to the individual's personal LinkedIn. So that's what I'm saying, it's complicated. So if we had Jump LinkedIn accounts that were paid for by Jump, then the data's Jump's. If it's your LinkedIn, that's your personal LinkedIn, then Jump doesn't own that data. That doesn't mean that in your shareholder agreement with Jump or your contract with Jump that we couldn't restrict your ability to deal with people who are in your personal network from a business point of view.
So that's interesting, isn't it? Because my understanding was that LinkedIn actually owns the data because it's on the LinkedIn platform and we are renting that data. And therefore, if anything is from a LinkedIn point of view, I don't own the data. Jump wouldn't own the data. It's LinkedIn that owns the data. So it's how they deal with that data.
But the reality is, in terms of post-termination restrictions, and Annette makes a really good point on the chat, it is really complicated. Social media contracts, data ownership. It isn't actually about where the data is, whether it's on LinkedIn, on WhatsApp, if it's in your CRM. If you write your post-termination restrictions well, what happens is we say, well, if you are dealing with that person for my business, so we'll use Jump as an example. If I'm dealing with that client or that candidate from Jump in Jump time, it doesn't matter whether that data is on LinkedIn or the connection was made with LinkedIn, they're effectively a jump client or a jump candidate, and that means if I leave, I can't continue to deal with them if my post-termination restrictions are written well. So it's not about who owns the data, it's about whether our post-termination restrictions enable us to continue working with them or not.
So it's how you link the two, because David Barrett's asked the question is, can you recommend an experienced lawyer who can draft post-termination restrictive clauses? We'll come to you privately on that one, David.
Yeah, absolutely,
from there.
David.
And what Annette's thought is absolutely right. LinkedIn is an absolute legal minefield, but if you have your post-termination clauses correct, then it's a less of a minefield, but there still is that. So let's just push back on GDPR for 2 seconds. Okay, so there was a huge fuss when GDPR first came in, and let's look at it this way: if you were concerned that someone had or has extracted data illegally, how can you challenge that person and claim that data back?
You absolutely can, and there are that's completely separate from the employment relationship, Howard. So theft of data is criminal, right? It isn't, and so you want solicitors, at the very least, you might potentially want to involve the police in this. Data has a value, and your data cannot be stolen. And actually, sometimes going down that, making sure people understand that taking this business's data is a criminal offence is a really valuable and powerful message to send to people, because people sometimes just don't understand that what they're doing is very, very serious. And so, absolutely, you can get them to delete the data, and you can, there are all kinds of types of action that you could take potentially to get people to delete data that they have taken from you. It's really serious, taking especially significant amounts of personal data, which sometimes people take the whole lot of candidate compliance records. That's really serious data theft.
So it's interesting that I'm in the same agreement that it's an illegal action, especially even more so since GDPR came in.
Yeah.
So why is it then that when I started to try find recruiters who had been taken to court for stealing data, etc., I could hardly find any, if at all, any on Google, etc. Why is it, do you think, that recruitment agencies then are a little bit scared to take that type of action? Because once you took that type of action, that would send a clear message across the whole business that if you do extract data in that fashion, then we will prosecute you through the right channels. It's nothing to do about preventing them working, etc. It's about a legal precedent. Why do you think that recruitment agencies there are a little bit frightened to do that type of thing?
I don't think they are. I think what happens, Howard, is that when you make somebody aware that what they've done is they're criminally liable for it, it's illegal. It's not just a breach of contract issue where we're going for injunctions. This is criminal. They back off really fast. My experience is when you tell people that that's the case, and you get serious about it, they just back off and delete the data. And so you never end up having to go to court about that sort of thing. And the reality is, when we're talking about data theft, we're talking about criminal prosecution, which is outside of your hands. It's not a civil matter then, it's a police matter, and you wouldn't be able to find information about it on the internet, because it would become public prosecutions to do with something illegal, of breaking the law, rather than a breach of contract, which you would find you'd find reporting about. So I think what happens is people back off really quickly when they understand that we're going to get the police involved in this. That's my experience.
So Nett's just jumped in and asked the question I was just about to ask. The company is responsible for the data from a GDPR perspective. So the company is liable if the data has gone outside the company, whoever takes it. They don't want to get into a legal battle. But if it is taken, then why are we not trying to pursue that? It's a real interesting point to me, because the amount of data that does sort of go round, how many times do I see people, let's just take simple contracts of employment. Where did you get this contract from? It's gone from an employer, from an ex-employer, from an ex-employer, etc. And you read
so that sort of stuff gets shared all the time. It's like training materials. It gets shared all the time. There's no real commercial value to it, not enough to make it worth going to court about it. I think Annette's point is really important. Part of it is you don't want to let people know that you've lost data. The most important stuff from a GDPR point of view is personal data, because we are going to be in trouble if we've lost personal data. So we don't want to shout about it. We don't want people to know. But I also, my experience when I was head of legal is I did pursue people and I got data back and I got data deleted. So, we absolutely vigorously pursued anybody, and the message went out across the organization. It's not worth taking data from this organization, because they will pursue it, they will protect their data. And so there is a difference between the odd bit of training material, the odd contract of employment, the odd terms of business, which we know get shared around all over the place, and reams of candidate personal data, which becomes much more significant. And I think organizations do pursue it quite rightly.
So here's a question then. So if a consultant leaves and starts calling your client base or starts calling your candidate base, and that's happening, realistically, then what's the best course of action that you could take?
So I don't know if this will be a popular answer, or even whether it's surprising or not. You can take court cases and you can get lawyers involved and you can look at taking out injunctions if you've got good evidence and good contract wordings. And I've done that. Do I think ultimately that's the right way to do it? No, I really don't. I think you spend huge amounts of time and huge amounts of money. And actually my personal preference is what you do is you focus on tightly holding your clients. So you work hard on making sure that you don't have clients who only have relationships with one consultant who might leave and try to take them with you. You work hard at making sure that client wants to continue to work with you, and you draw that client into you to protect your work. You spend the effort that you would spend on a court case and a solicitor and an injunction, spend it on working to have that client want to carry on working with you in a really positive and proactive way, rather than on the negativity of, by all means, make sure the consultant understands that if they don't stop, that you'll go to court. But honestly, the focus of your effort should be on strengthening your relationship with your clients.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I was going to say the same thing. When we talked to Fairmountain about the value of your business, one of the things they talked about was the percentage of the biggest clients compared to your turnover. So are you a eggs in basket? And then they talked about then the percentage of your turnover by your biggest consultants. And they said there's one of the real big question marks about how vulnerable is your business if that big consultant left and therefore took that data. And took that knowledge of that client, let alone just took the data. And what they were saying then is that having that level selling going in at different levels and have different people selling to different levels within that client means that you safeguard that client for your company. You don't ever have a single point of contact that controls that whole data. And that's the big comment, that when we talk about, it's not just about going from a legal point of view, it's looking at your business processes that sit behind that to ensure that if you ever got into that situation that you're mitigating the problem.
It's much better to focus on strengthening your relationship with your client, making sure you don't have single point of contact, making sure you've got deep and that goes for single point of contact in your recruitment business as well as single point of contact in your client, right? You don't want one consultant dealing with one hiring manager in your client, because that hiring manager moves on, you've lost the relationship as well. So we should be spider webbing in our organizations and in our client organizations, and that cultural way of tightening and strengthening relationships is far more effective than having post-termination restrictions that are well worded and threats of legal action.
So Kaz wants to turn it on its head. Do you think then it's time employers should start challenging the covenant of consultants they have hired that are clearly weighted towards the old employer, e.g. 1 week's notice for 6 months coverage?
I think I love the idea of that I really do. I think the problem is with that by the time somebody is leaving an organization, it's too late. So I think when you join an organization, you should, too few people read the contract and understand what they're signing up to. So I would want to really read and understand, I understand enough about restrictions to know what I'm signing. So many people sign them without really understanding what they're tying up to. So, and the other thing that's really interesting with that, I think, which is similar, is thinking about our own attitude. So if we don't expect our recruitment consultants when they leave us to take our data and use it and breach their post-termination restrictions, how did we behave when they joined us? So when they joined us, did we expect them to comply with the restrictions they had from their previous employer? Were we respectful of that? And in which case, why would we, if we weren't, if we said, oh, you can just ignore your restrictions, why would we not expect them to ignore them when they leave? So there is something about reciprocity, that's really not the right, but treating people the way we expect to be treated. You've got to create that culture. Yeah.
It was quite interesting because we had a consultant that came to work for a company that I was with, and they were owed a rather large, should I say, payment on when they finished the work with their client on commission, and the client refused to pay the commission. And it was interesting when we put that in front of a lawyer, because we then got the chasing letters, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. And so we spoke to a lawyer about it just to see what we could do, just to see where we were. And he said, well, if they have negated that part of the contract, if you took that to court, the judge will say, well, hang on a minute, you won't pay with that part of the contract, but you want to abide by that part of the contract, therefore we'll throw the whole contract out.
Yeah.
It's meaningless. And
yeah,
so it means
exactly, that's a really good point, Howard, we should make on that. People don't always understand that. If you have a leaver and you don't properly pay them out of your organization, so you don't properly comply with all your legal obligations to them, you will totally undermine your contract, and all your post-termination restrictions, however carefully you've worded them, will fall away and will become completely unenforceable. Yeah. So you decide you're going to withhold some contractual commission or some holiday pay or some notice pay, and that effectively puts you in breach of contract, and your contracts will fall away and they're totally negated.
Yeah. And that's the bit that we've got to start to think about, is that when we're putting our contract in front of it, currently, again, that's the same sort of question. Do we feel uncomfortable and apprehensive getting challenged by a new joiner, especially about our terms? And that's maybe because they haven't read it, they haven't understood what we're there. And I think that's down to us to really explain to the people what they're signing. And then if they do want to challenge them, we have either a complete blanket, it is what it is, you join on that, or you start to change. But once you start to change everyone's contract. It becomes a little bit messy, I think, on that sort of front. So I think, you've got to stand by your clauses and say, these are my clauses, these are what are going to stay. So the big question then that we're going to sort of jump in. So if a key player, in fact, any consultant sort of handed in their notice, from a back office point of view, what's the best practice to actually undertake as that consultant exits the business?
So I think one of the most important things that you can do is have a conversation, and this relates to something I said a few minutes ago. You need to have a similar conversation with people joining, okay, as people exiting. So you can't suddenly start to be interested in restrictions when somebody leaves if you weren't interested in restrictions when they joined, especially if they joined from a competitor. So I caveat this with that, but I would sit and have a conversation with somebody. I would always want to effectively create positive relationships with people when they leave. I understand that that's not always possible, but we should try to have a sensible conversation where we understand that people move on, right? We also understand that sometimes people move to our competitors, but we can do it in a way that everybody behaves in a, we use the word adult, but a professional way. So I would make sure in a conversation, face to face, eyeball to eyeball, they understand what the restrictions say. Yeah, they understand what they mean. They understand that data is protected in this organization and valued, and they can't take it with them. And you just make it very, very clear what your expectations are and what it was that they signed up to in their contract, which is why I'd have the conversation at the beginning when they join too, so they're not surprised, because you've set this cultural expectation of, you know, in the same way we expected you to comply with the restriction, which when you join us, we expect you to comply with. 6 months down the road, or however long your restrictions are, fill your boots, do what you want, but for the next 6 months we expect you to comply with this contract that you signed. And I would have a very professional conversation about that. And then I'd also make sure I behaved well as an employer. So I would make sure I sat and explained to them, this is what you're entitled to be paid, this is how your commission's going to work as you exit the business, these are the rules. And I would be, you know, the worst ones are when people are treated badly by their employer and they're not paid out properly, and then, as you say, how they suddenly start wanting to chase restrictions.
So what we're saying then is, if we set the precedent from day one, this is the terms and conditions of the contract of employment that you have signed, this is what they mean, so they understand the features and the benefits, also the advantages and the potential disadvantages, okay, but they understand what that actually means. Then when they hand their notice in, if you then follow best practice, this is what we're going to do. We're going to re-establish what you understand of that, so they understand everything that's going, and treat them the way that you would treat any normal employee, just that they're exiting. Then we start to have a far better understanding of where they go. So there's no grey area, there's no sort of issues that we can do, which leads to the question which often happens, you know, your big player comes in, resigns, you instantly waltz them out of the office, put them on garden leave, etc. So what's the pros and cons then of putting people onto garden leave? Because that's not usually mentioned within a contract, and if it is, it's usually mentioned in the handbook, you know, etc. What's the pros and cons of garden leave?
I'm a great believer in garden leave. I think it's fab. And I also think it should be in your contract. So it should be mentioned and it should be absolutely explicit. So the value of garden leave is to create a gap between you leaving one organization and be able to start in another. Yeah. So, and I think being able to enforce that period of time in a sales context is really valuable. So you want to have a period of time, normally a couple of months, where they are no longer dealing with the candidates and the clients for you, but they're also prevented from dealing with the clients and the candidates at their new employer. That gives you a buffer zone for you to do what we talked about earlier, which is strengthen, re-establish new contacts, get those client relationships to as good a place as you can get them, so that when your leaver is out of restrictions and they start going after your clients and candidates, you've had a buffer period to build and strengthen your relationships with them. So that, I think garden leave is really helpful, but it should be in your contract of employment. The ability to put somebody on garden leave and the rules about how garden leave work should be there. And that again should be discussed during your exit meeting that you have, that we talked about in the previous question. And I've seen some people play lovely funny games. I had somebody who negotiated a longer notice period with their line manager, got it put in writing, and then resigned because they thought we were going to put them on garden leave, and they'd tried to negotiate this really long period of effectively paid leave. Yeah, so we were a big enough organization to be able to say, well, actually no, we're not, you know, that's not, you're not going to play us like that. And so we just moved them to do a different job for that period of time, and they were not happy about it at all, because they were looking forward to having 3 months sitting at home doing nothing. And in fact, we had them working on, you know, admin function completely separate from their job, which wound them up.
Yeah. And that's again, that's that, you know, how do you make the person feel when they leave, you know, is really important from there.
It really is.
And this is the question that David's sort of throwing: is it important to not have your commission structure as part of your contract of employment? And my understanding is, irrespective whether it's in your contract or whether it's in your handbook, as soon as you start paying off that structure and it's in a handbook, then that becomes a lawful binding contract. Now that's interesting, because that's what we had this question last time at Simon Block was on, and he was saying that will become part of your contract. So if it's in your contract, fine, but if it's in your handbook, then as soon as you pay off it and there's a link between your handbook and your contract, that becomes a legal binding status.
So there's a difference between legally binding status and contractually binding status. So if your contract says you'll get paid this salary, and there is a commission policy, but the commission policy can be changed at any time, and the rules will be notified to you separately. And some people put in, and as soon as anybody resigns, no more commission is payable. That's in some contracts I've seen.
Yeah.
Right. Then you've got rules that enable you not to pay commission once somebody leaves. So it just depends on how your rules are written. Now, what we're saying is you might still be able to pursue somebody for not paying wages, so an unfair deduction from wages claim or something like that, because you've not paid out commission under the rules of the scheme, and so you should be able to do it. But what you can't claim is a breach of contract claim, because it's not a contractual term, which means your restrictions won't fall away. Yeah, because that's what you're trying to avoid, is if you mess about with the money, that you're not doing something to impact on your restrictions. I mean, my advice is don't mess about with the money, right? Never mess about with the money. But it is quite important not to have it as a contractual term, because you don't want to breach contract claim as well as a wages claim.
Yeah. So before I answer the next question, I'm just going to turn the slide over, and obviously people want to understand what this slide is actually about. So Friday, I start my mad weekend where I'm doing a 55-mile bike ride. Saturday, I'm rowing Windermere, which is either 10 miles or 20 miles, depending on what the people decide when we get there. We drive back to Leeds. We're going to walk 10 miles for a friend who unfortunately passed away. We're going to visit all his favourite pubs and collect all his favourite pubs. One of his comments before he passed away was, he didn't know he was actually dying, because he died very quickly. And he said, wouldn't it be great if we came in all these pubs and we all died and got all this money off all these people, etc., etc., etc. And then on Sunday, I hadn't realised I'd signed up to do a Tough Mudder for a charity. So if you want to sponsor me, take a picture of the QR, get your camera out, float over the QR code, and off you go. The last question, and if you do, thank you very much. The last question is, I often see reports in papers of constructive dismissal due to unlawful procedures or processes, etc. So either putting people through disciplinary, or, as you say, not paying the right the right amount of money off the contract, etc., etc. How often in your experience, when you put people through sort of disciplinary processes, or you're going through the process where they resign and you try save them, how often do you, in your experience, have you turned this person around so they become an actual good, profitable person back within the business that you always wanted?
Okay. Before I answer that question, let me just very quickly answer David. David, if your commission structures are separate in separate Word documents, that's great, that's helpful, but just check what's written in your contract about commission. So if there's nothing written at all, sometimes it's very helpful in your contract to be specific, to say commission is not a contractual term. So I can have a look at it for you if you want me to. Contact me on LinkedIn or email me at Jump, and I'll have a quick look at yours for you if you want me to. So disciplinary. Do you know, I think it's really interesting. I have very, very often seen good performance management turn people around. Whether or not that's in the context of a disciplinary procedure or not depends on how your organisation has set up your performance management. Most of the time, if you're going to be able to turn somebody around, you can do it before you ever get to formal disciplinary with good performance management. So, all the things that you and I teach people all the time, Howard, about being on top of things and being, good KPI management, good coaching for performance, all of those things will turn around performance before you ever get to disciplinary. If you get to a disciplinary in this industry, and I've been doing this a really long time, I've almost never got to the point of having to terminate somebody's employment through a disciplinary process, because the process is such that it signposts to somebody that the end is nigh, and so they will inevitably opt themselves out of the system by finding themselves another job and resigning before you ever get there. So almost never is the answer. Would you? Because by the time you get to a disciplinary process, you should have already done some really good coaching and positive performance management to turn them around. it is different if your disciplinary process is about some kind of behavioural issue. Sometimes people need something formal for them to understand that you actually do mean it and you take it seriously. And for some people, the formality of that can make a difference. But I think rarely is disciplinary anything other than, you know, bit school marmy. Don't really like it. Good management should stop you ever getting there.
But if you're going through that process, what you're saying is then usually if you're in that process, it's a signpost for that person. They normally hand their notice in, which is it. But if they don't,
that's my experience. Yeah.
But if they don't hand their notice in, then you need to follow due course of that process to make sure it's lawfully binding, and therefore what's written in your contract.
Yeah, the reason is because if you end up in an employment tribunal, the employment tribunal looks at two completely separate parts of it. So they'll say, did this employer make a reasonable decision? So was it a reasonable response to terminate somebody's employment? That's one half of it. And the other half is, and did they follow their own process? So you can make the most reasonable decision in the world, but if you don't follow your own process, you lose on a process point of view. You can follow the process, but make an unreasonable decision, you'll lose there. So you've got to get both of those things right. Follow your process exactly. So write your process to be easy to follow, and then make a reasonable decision at the end of it.
So what we're saying all the way through this process then is how our terms and conditions are written are really important. Making sure that our terms and conditions are written and they're watertight is important. Following our terms and conditions then to the letter of the law, both whether it's against us or for us, is really important to ensure that we don't come across this. How we store our data and where we store our data, if we control that a little bit tighter, makes it less easy for people to steal. But then following the GDPR processes and making people aware that that is a criminal act and you will act on that, again, should negate that type of behaviour.
And Howard, in addition to all of that, the culture in your business is the most important predictor of how people will behave when they leave. So it's that whole piece about how you treat people on the way in, how you treat people in the middle, and how you help them to exit. All of those things nudge people's behaviors, right? They nudge how they feel about you and they feel about your organization. And so getting that stuff right is just as important as having all of the policies in the right place and the right wording and avoiding court case. How you speak and behave and treat people, what you actually do, is just as important as all of those other things.
Heather, as always, thank you very much. It's a really insightful that one. I think there's loads and loads of things that people can take away from there. If you have any HR questions on your contracts that you've got, contact Heather. She'll certainly help you. David will come back to you directly with regard a lawyer if Heather can't help you and work from there. But I think, you know, what we've got to say is that, you know, terms and conditions, because we know at the moment that rec to recs are out there and they are hunting our staff absolutely mercilessly, and therefore you may be on the receiving side because you've taken somebody on, you may be on the other side because someone's left, and therefore getting your contract right is really important, but also understanding the clauses that the person comes with is really important as well, because they're obviously going to have to abide by those terms and conditions. So guys and ladies and gents, thanks very much for your time. It's been much appreciated. Next week, we're back with a new series of webinars. We've yet to write them, so that's what I'll be doing probably on Friday afternoon whilst I'm sort of resting and dying from rounding in the morning. But once again, thanks for your time. Heather, thanks for your time, and we'll see you all again next week. And if you have donated, much appreciated.
And good luck with your weekend, Howard. Good luck with it.
Thank you. Cheers. Thank you very much. Goodbye.